If you still can't fall asleep, then welcome to Sound from the Darkness. Night 5. The Scalpel. Many people study medicine because they are forced to. My college classmate Lynn was one of them. But there was nothing he could do because his whole family were doctors. 3 generations in his family had studied medicine, and both his grandfather and his father were very famous figures in the field. So, he said, from his first to his 8th choice on the university entrance exam, every single one was a medical school. It is undeniable that heredity plays a role. Lynn seemed born to be a doctor. He memorized even the hardest, thickest textbooks with astonishing precision. According to our classmates, he could recite every blood vessel in the human body, yet he often got lost on the way home. He graduated with top honors and declined the offer to stay at the university as a recommended postgraduate. We found it odd that he refused such a generous offer. But recently, while I was away on business, he called and told me to come at once, saying he had something important to tell me. So, after graduation, we sat down to talk, and of course, I asked why he had turned down the offer. The refusal was not Lynn's idea. It was his family's decision. His grandfather did not agree to graduate school and wanted Lynn to go to the hospital where he and Lynn's father worked. Perhaps the old man could not wait any longer. Lynn himself did not object, because this was the path his grandfather had chosen for him. Unfortunately, before Lynn officially started at the hospital, his grandfather died of a sudden cerebral hemorrhage. His grandfather's death was a heavy blow to the family. There were not many of them. Lynn was an only child, as was his father. After the funeral, Lynn's father gave him a box. "Here, this is what your grandfather told me to give you while he was still alive." His father handed the box to Lynn solemnly. This surprised Lynn, because in his eyes, his grandfather was sometimes very strict, even domineering. He had always thought his grandfather did not care for him, only forcing him to study medicine to uphold the family name. "This is your grandfather's treasure. You must keep it safe. You should know that even I am not qualified to inherit it. Your grandfather often said you were very suited to medicine. In your hands, this will be more useful," his father said slowly. Lynn's heart filled with grief and longing for his grandfather. When Lynn said this, I couldn't help asking what was in the box. Lynn said his grandfather's instruction was not to open it until the day he had no way to save a patient. Lynn grew up to be an outstanding doctor, and his medical career seemed to go very smoothly. He often joked that perhaps it was his grandfather's spirit in heaven blessing him. But before long, he encountered a patient he could not cure, no matter what he tried. The patient came last week. When he stood before me, I saw a big round ball of a man. People say clothes make the man, but even though this fat man wore designer brands, I could still feel his vulgarity and coarseness. Most of all, as soon as he entered, I smelled a foul stench. A group trailed behind him. It didn't look like a consultation, more like a gang negotiation. Though he was well dressed and dripping money, he had many underlings. But I knew illness had tormented him, because his doughy fat face looked like it had been kneaded by someone. His features had melted into each other, Lynn said, slipping into a lecture-like cadence. I was shocked that in winter he wore only thin underwear beneath his coat, and I noticed his men carried many sets of the same clothes. When I asked about his condition, he looked uneasy and finally ordered everyone out, leaving just the 2 of us in the room. I will never forget what he revealed after taking off his coat and clothes. It was a horrifying disease I had never seen in all my years as a doctor. Lynn's voice trembled a little. His Adam's apple bobbed just a bit, but I still noticed. His back could hardly be called a back anymore. Imagine a giant wasp nest. The extent of the ulceration and the density of the lesions were so great that his granulation tissue could not grow normally, and the wounds tore into each other. I was amazed he was still alive. The stench of pus was overwhelming, but I am a doctor, so I held my breath and examined the wounds closely. They were truly strange. Looking at them, you'd feel as if someone had pressed a powerful diamond finger from a Waxier novel into the flesh. Each lesion was a perfect circle, yet sunken and beginning to neck. And as I watched, something shocked me. I saw, with my own eyes, a fingerprint slowly forming on the right side of his neck near the clavicle, one of the few muscles still intact. At first it was a simple dimple, then it deepened and finally turned black. I knew the blood vessels there were dying, and eventually, like a punctured water bag, a new wound formed. Strangely, even as this happened, the man seemed entirely unaware. When the examination ended, I signaled him to get dressed. I truly could not bear to look any longer. I asked when it had begun. He replied in pain that it had been nearly a month. At first he did not think much of it because it didn't hurt, but later he noticed his clothes soaked with pus and blood and a rotten stench from his body. He had to see a doctor. Then I understood why he carried so many changes of clothes. At this point, Lynn suddenly looked at me and said, "Do you know what surprised me most? I'm not a dermatologist, and I hadn't been practicing that long. Why did he come to me for such a grave condition?" I asked him then, but he kept silent. I had no choice but to have him come back while I considered solutions. Watching him stagger away, I suddenly remembered my grandfather's legacy. The box lay quietly by my bed at home. Perhaps it was time to open it. Right then, Lynn went into his room and brought out a box. It was dark green, about a hand's length. When Lynn took it out, I was struck by an eerie green glow from within. Lynn slowly opened the box before me. The moment he lifted the lid, I doubted my eyes, because I seemed to see something transparent slip out of it. At last we saw what was inside. We were a little disappointed to find only a surgical scalpel, but it was peculiar. The handle was gold, and the blade. There was no blade at all. Lynn carefully lifted the scalpel, wondering why it had only a handle and no blade. Suddenly he cried out, "Ah!" We realized it wasn't bladeless at all, but the blade was so thin it looked like air, completely transparent. Lynn had been careless, and the keen edge had nicked him. Blood quickly ran along the blade, revealing its true shape. The blade was significantly longer than the handle, about an inch longer than half a standard scalpel. While Lynn was bandaging his finger, I suddenly noticed what looked like streaks of blood on the transparent edge. I held it up to the light. They were not blood streaks, but two tiny lines of characters. A doctor uses skill to save the body and kindness to save the soul. Just those 10 words. Is this what your grandfather left you for the day you run out of options? I come from an intellectual family. Perhaps your father knows the secret. Useless. My father is probably like us. He's never heard anyone mention it. But when he was alive, my grandfather was a very famous surgeon. Unlike other specialists, he was best at diagnosing and treating strange illnesses. Since most such patients did not want their cases known, even though he was renowned, he could not become a world-famous miracle doctor on those cases alone. It seemed Lynn's grandfather had indeed been very discreet. But what could this scalpel actually do? At the very least, how could I treat this man's back? I asked Lynn, but he stayed silent. I finally suggested leaving the scalpel with me. The patient's condition was so bizarre, why had he chosen only Lin? Lin nodded and said he had seen many strange cases and wanted me to investigate the patient with him. I smiled. You never come to me for good news. We quickly found out who the fat man was. He was no ordinary person. He was a local construction boss with many crews under him, responsible for many projects. He did not look like an upright businessman. He withheld wages and skimmed materials, but otherwise his actions were not criminal. He described a normal diet and sleep habits, and had no history of exposure to toxins or back trauma. This baffled us. Although I knew his symptoms resembled certain meow insect poisons, they did not match exactly, and victims of toxins that potent rarely survive. In his state he would not last long. Moreover, finding a poisoner in this era would be extremely difficult. Fine, let's scare him and ask why he chose you to treat him. Maybe that's where the answer lies. Sure enough, when Fatty heard us say he did not have long to live, he panicked like a fat bug sprayed with pesticide. He sobbed that he knew Lin's grandfather had a scalpel, and the one who held it could cure all terminal diseases. Lin and I were stunned. It seemed a patient treated by his grandfather had told him. But Fatty said no one had ever seen how Lin's grandfather used the scalpel. We returned to examine the strange scalpel. I surprised myself by slicing my own hand with it. It hurt, of course, but the pain vanished quickly. I looked again, and the cut had sealed almost at once, like a zipper. Without the smear of blood, there would have been no mark at all. Lin looked at me oddly. You're insane. Did your cut heal fast the last time? I asked. Lin thought. Could this scalpel rapidly heal wounds? Yes, that's the meaning of the first line. Use skill to save the body. And the second line, use kindness to save the soul. Lin asked. Don't worry about that yet. Let's save Fatty first. We immediately brought him to the hospital for surgery. Since we had the miraculous scalpel, Lin planned to operate with just me assisting. In truth, it was an experiment on Fatty. But his condition allowed no more experiments. His wounds were rotten. Through the necrotic holes we could see the thick, fat, and even bone. Lin called for immediate surgery, but the hospital refused, citing a high mortality risk and demanding a transfer. He said he had seen many doctors and only worsened. If Lin refused, he would sue the hospital and Lin for delay, and both would face legal action. The hospital agreed reluctantly. Lin specifically asked me to scrub in. He did not want any other assistance, so no one would learn of his grandfather's scalpel. Anesthetizing him was not easy. I wondered if we should double the dose. Lin used the scalpel to make a circular incision around one healing wound. Sure enough, it began to close rapidly as pus and blood drained out. It truly was a miraculous scalpel. We were awed. There were many lesions. We carefully excised them one by one. Wherever the edge touched, muscle and skin sealed quickly. At last, only the largest and most critical wound on the back remained. It reached down to the spine. I still did not understand why the man felt no pain. The instant the blade touched the wound, a miracle happened. The fat man stood up by himself. There was no way that much anesthetic could wear off so fast. We stared in horror as he slowly sat up. He stepped down from the table. The drape fell away. He stood there, completely naked. I thought suddenly of pig carcasses hanging in a slaughterhouse. You cannot stop me. The fat man suddenly spoke in a shrill, razor-edged woman's voice. Stranger still, I did not see his lips move. This bastard must die, the fat man said again. Lynn trembled all over. This was beyond a doctor's remit. "Who are you?" I asked. "Level. I told you, he must die. I won't let you ruin my plan." The voice grew louder. If it kept screaming, it would draw people. "Fine. We won't save him, but you must stop yelling. If you want him dead, tell us why." I tried to calm whatever it was. The fat man stood there like a corpse, but I noticed the area over his heart bulging. "I said it already. He can only die." The thing was full of hatred and refused to explain. While steadying myself, I signaled Lynn to step out and call for help. We had to restrain the man. I saw him, like a sleepwalker, grab a nearby scalpel and slowly draw it across his neck. If we waited for Lynn to return, he'd be finished. I do not know where the idea came from, but I suddenly shouted, "Your husband wouldn't want you to do this." I was completely guessing. Or perhaps gambling was better than freezing. It worked. The thing stopped, and so did the fat man. At that moment, Lynn burst back in with several staff and restrained him. He was put back under anesthesia. Both of us were drenched in cold sweat. "Do not touch the last wound on his back. I want a cardiac CT first," I told Lynn. "A CT of the heart." "Why?" Lynn asked, puzzled. "I'm following orders, and too many people have seen that movie." Minutes later, we were looking at his cardiac CT. We were speechless. The scan clearly showed a human face. In other words, the fat man's heart had literally evolved into a human face. "It's nothing," Lynn said with a forced smile. "I'm afraid the real cause lies in the heart. We need another surgery," I said. This time Lynn could not operate alone, so he reported everything. The hospital director took it very seriously. Several cardiac surgeons assembled for the operation, and of course Lynn and I joined. When the heart came into view, we all froze. It was enormous, and it truly was a human face, or rather, the face of a woman with her eyes closed. The facial area lay right where the heart was. Now Lynn had to cut it away. As Lynn's blade touched the face, it suddenly opened its eyes, and, with its mouth call, it a mouth bit down on the scalpel. It let out the same shrill, piercing laugh as before. The other doctors were petrified. A nearby nurse fainted. "Let go. This is pointless," I said to the face. It glared at me with hatred. Suddenly, it spat out a torrent of words. "What do you know? You only look at him because he has money. Treatment is for the rich. Have you ever treated my child? Who treats idiots like us? Call a vet." Hearing this, the experts bolted, screaming, "Ghost." I had to concede she had a point. "Can you tell us everything?" Lynn asked earnestly. The expression on the face seemed moved, and the voice softened. "I don't want to say much. Ask a worker named Agong. He knows it all. I advise you to save fewer people like him. I know I can't resist that knife." She glanced at Lynn's scalpel and fell silent. Lynn tried touching it again, and nothing happened. He immediately cut the face away. The moment it detached, it dissolved into blood, leaving only a single needle. The incident was covered up. That is what hospitals do best. The terrified experts convinced themselves it was a hallucination. I waited for Lynn to file his report and close things out before we went to find the worker named Agong. We found him at last in a warehouse. He looked like a half-charred log, dark and gaunt. Long-term malnutrition and overwork had left him frail and spent. I could not help thinking that, living like this, he would not withstand illness. Once he fell sick, he would be eliminated, like in the brutal hierarchy of nature, because he could not afford treatment. After we told our story, Agon's first question was, "Is Fatty dead?" It left us at a loss. Lynn finally said awkwardly that Fatty was fine and recovering well. Agoing sneered at us, then slowly told it all. The face we saw on the heart belonged to a woman named Xiaofeng. She and her husband were from the same hometown as Agong. The three came to the city to work. Agong and Xiaofeng's husband worked at Fatty's construction site, while Xiaofeng did odd jobs. Life was hard, but manageable. Then their child fell gravely ill and needed urgent hospital fees. Fatty withheld their wages. When husband and other workers came to demand pay, the police arrested them for disturbance. In the end, Xiaofeng's husband doused Fatty with gasoline to threaten him. Fatty ignored him, and Xiaofeng's husband accidentally stepped near an open flame at the site and burned to death right in front of Fatty. Agoing could only try to comfort Xiaofeng. She insisted on suing Fatty, with a foregone result. Their child, without funds for treatment, died in a hospital corridor. Finally, Xiaofeng went mad and disappeared. No one knew whether she lived or died. When he finished, Agone looked at us with contempt and said, "You can go." Then he slapped the dust off and went back to work. Lynn and I were silent for a long time. Lynn asked me, "What does the last line on the scalpel mean? Save the soul with kindness." I did not answer because I did not know. After thinking, I told my friend, maybe what Lynn's grandfather meant by saving souls was actually the doctor's own soul. My friend suddenly understood. He patted my shoulder, pleased. Right. Why didn't I think of that? A doctor must have kindness. That is a doctor with a soul. What happened to Xiaofeng? After hearing him, I felt a quiet pity for that poor woman. I don't know. I still don't understand what kind of magic she used to cut into Fatty. But Lynn's grandfather's scalpel is truly miraculous, and its origin is mysterious. Lynn has been discharged from that case. His father fully supports him. Now he is a doctor who often treats and prescribes for free. Show kindness and save the soul, I said. Agreed, my friend replied.